According to his Florida Grand Opera bio, Jorge Martin is a Cuban-born composer who emigrated to the U.S. in 1964. He studied at Yale and Columbia University and received the 1998 American Academy of Arts and Letters Academy Award in Music. His opera, Before Night Falls, is based on the memoirs of Cuban writer Reinaldo Arenas. It had its world premiere at the Fort Worth Opera in 2010. Martin divides his time between Vermont and New York City, or as he puts it, between deepest countryside and the citiest city on earth. He also has strong ties to South Florida. Welcome to Cultural Charles Greenfield, Jorge Martin.
Hello, Charles. Good to be here.
Let me talk first a little about my experience with Reinaldo Arenas. I interviewed him in New York in 1981 for the Los Angeles Times. He told me about being arrested at the beach, reading poetry, thrown in Havana's dank, subhuman El Morro castle prison, Jehovah's Witnesses being beaten for their beliefs, and suicides by broken bottles. But he also said he supported the revolution at the start. He came from a very poor campesino background and received an education and a job at the National Library. As for Cuba, he repeated one word to me: survival. But when he was in New York, he implied there was another danger: too much freedom and abundance. Who was this enigmatic man, and how did you discover him?
I discovered him when his memoir was published, which is to say after he had died in 1990. The memoir came out in 93 in English, and I first read it in English. And that is how I learned about him. He nevertheless was a famous and very important Latin American author, even in his own day, which is why he was a cause célèbre, because he was an important writer who, it was known, was being suppressed. His works were suppressed in Cuba. He had to smuggle his works out of Cuba to have them published, which got him in deeper hot water with the government. And he was also imprisoned for a time. So he was a well-known author that was also a political prisoner.
Want us to fail. Homosexuals are immoral, a disease that weakens our society. And believe me, we will cleanse ourselves of you. Writers can be dangerous too, like Ovidio and his faggot friends, and you. Writers can be dangerous.
Now, you've spoken in the past about how you saw the operatic possibilities in Arenas' book Before Night Falls, largely because of, as you said, Arenas himself. He's bigger than life and very human. Explain what you mean and give us a very brief summary of the opera.
Yes, well, when you read the memoir, part of what I found so engaging was his range of color and emotion. There's the Cuban humor in it, which I related to, and there were harrowing scenes of torture and other difficulties. His escapes or attempts to escape, and there were tragic suicides and betrayals, very charged situations. And then the most amazing moment of all, when he actually manages to escape Cuba through the Mariel boatlift, which was a chaotic time in Cuba, and he took advantage of that chaos to slip in between the holes to get out. And so it's a character that I could imagine singing. As a matter of fact, he says, I shout, my work is my shout, and my loudest shout. And in a sense, singing is a beautiful aesthetic kind of shout into a public arena. So that essentially makes it, I think, a suitable subject. And then the themes and the situations and the characters, that was where I had to be most creative, shall we say. to create a storyline in the theater that has Reinaldo interacting with significant characters. And so I created characters that embody a number of other characters. So the opera is basically like the story, like the book is framed because Reinaldo was writing it knowing that he was about to die very soon. He was diagnosed with AIDS, and in those days, it was a death sentence. So that's why he called it Before Night Falls. He was racing the clock to finish it before he died. So at the beginning of the memoir, he tells you the situation. Then he goes back to his infancy in Cuba, growing up, and his story, his escapes, and so forth. And then at the end, again, it's the end. And of course, he can't narrate his own death, but you know that it's coming. And he leaves a very beautiful, touching suicide note, which culminates in a line that Cuba will be free, and I already am. And that is actually his last line in the opera.
Well,
I'd like to say one thing more, is that it's not a tragedy. I think that would be very untrue to the work. And so I didn't want the work to be kind of La Traviata type tragedy with the hero or heroine dying at the end. That's not the end of the opera, actually. There's a little magical epilogue, which I won't give away, but it's changes the tone.
Right, and I'm thinking of musical precedents or antecedents, Beethoven's Fidelio and the famous Prisoner's Chorus, or perhaps Verdi's Don Carlo.
Well, actually, you mentioned, I think if I had to be forced to say what my favorite opera is, it would be Don Carlo. But yes, I mean, these I know these works, and they are my models, you aim very high so that you can fall somewhere not too low. And yes, and the Cuban people also is very much a character in this, in the background. And so I thought that was an excellent opportunity for choral writing. And the chorus, in fact, is a huge character in the work, especially in Act Two. They play many different scenes. In Mariel, they play the rioters, they play the prisoners. In Act One, they play the people at Mariel. They play people that at celebrating New Year's Eve in Manhattan. Also, so they play many different roles, and there is that in the operatic tradition. I suppose the most famous would be Boris Godunov, where the chorus is the Russian people. This doesn't rise to that grandeur, but it is in the tradition.
Now, when you approach a composition, you're searching for some core idea or structure where emotion has to emerge. Was there an image that hit you? Was it the catalyst? Give us a glimpse into the creative work itself, briefly. Well,
I think it's hard to say because it's been a long time. It's a long time ago. And actually rehearsing it now, it feels almost like somebody else's work. I have a bit of a distance on it, which is good. But I basically, I wrote the libretto first, and that, for me, is suggests the musical possibilities and the flow of the work. The pacing of it is very important, so I know what the movement or the feeling is meant to be at certain parts along the way. And then the words may suggest melodies or rhythms. Actually, there's a Cuban rhythm, a couple that occur all throughout the work in many different guises, fast and slow, and subtle and not so subtle. So that's also a unifying idea.
Are those dance rhythms?
Yes, of course. They are a couple of different clave patterns.
Okay. That important to most Cuban musicians in the 19th and, of course, the 20th century. I'd like to move on to the actual Act One. The orchestra's brass begins a somewhat menacing crescendo with snare drums that merges into the chorus singing Victoria. I'm not sure, is that the very beginning or is that towards the beginning of Act One? And there's no single voice, but orchestral and choral sound. Is that emblematic of something important in the opera?
Well, in that scene, I had a big decision to make, how to dramatize. This is right after the victorious revolution in 1959, and Castro's taken power. And in that scene, I needed to communicate the excitement of the time. There was genuine idealism involved, and yet also the brutality that soon became evident and disillusioned a lot of followers. And so the music could either communicate that or go against and comment on the situation. I decided to go with a depiction of the excitement, which nowadays reads as somebody, a reviewer from Texas, said it was an appropriately shallow march tune, and that's not wrong. I tried to imitate a little bit the Cuban anthem, national anthem, and it's martial and very much triumphalist. But that turns at the end of the scene. It turns very, very dark, and so the hymn itself turns very menacing. And that same melodic line that I use for the hymn becomes a theme throughout, which gets transformed into the prisoner's chorus, and also when Mariel comes, when the people leave Cuba joyously.
Now, we have three key scenes, it seems to me, in the opera. Let's briefly discuss each one. It's key to the plot and its musical significance. The first is with soprano Elizabeth Caballero's aria at the end of the first scene.
Right. And so I created these two muses, the sea and the moon. The sea is a mezzo, the moon is a soprano. And one of them plays Reinaldo's mother in the story. And really only in that scene. So I make the connection between a muse and his mother. And in that scene, Reinaldo is an adolescent, and he has announced that he is sick of being in this little village, and he's going to join the rebels in the mountains, which is a difficult moment for his mother. But it's a moment when she communicates to him something to guide him through life, and it's a vision of hopefulness, and so the musical themes there are associated with the muse, but that also goes throughout the opera.
Now, the second scene or important moment would be baritone Elliot Midori's aria at the top of Act Two.
Right. What magic color is the sea? By this time, he has been in prison and been released. And so he is somewhat dejected. And he is viewing the sea, the beautiful sea, and the way it has all these magical colors and manifestations. And yet now he sees the sea as an imprisonment. It surrounds the island, and it's a barrier to his getting away. So the sea can be magnificent and powerful, and yet also imprisoning. He considers Cuba. This is an image in Reinaldo Arenas' work. Cuba as a floating prison, and so he is bemoaning the situation of the Cuban people at the time.
Right, and then the final, the third one is the postlude to duet in Act halfway through Act Two. Right,
and that's after a duet that Reinaldo, the baritone, has with his friend Lázaro, tenor. And in that scene, Lázaro has received his visa to leave through Mariel. And of course, Reinaldo, as a dissident, cannot get a visa. And so they're saying goodbye to each other. But also Lázaro is saying goodbye to Cuba in that. And that music is very nostalgic Cuban style music.
I had referred to or alluded to the fact that when I spoke to Reinaldo Arenas, he did not say that New York was the paradise that one would suppose it would be after fleeing Cuba. He talked about too much abundance and too much freedom. Towards the end of Act Two, or actually at the end of the opera, is there some of this reflected in the way you wrote and used lyrics to give a feeling of this sort of imprisonment which never really ends?
Right. Yeah. The New Year's scene in Manhattan is I suppose it would be 1987 when he was diagnosed with AIDS, and he found out that he had this disease. And in that scene, again with Lázaro, they're reunited outside of Cuba. Reinaldo has escaped, and he's in Cuba, in Manhattan. And in that scene, Reinaldo complains to Lázaro about the fact that he escapes one prison only to land in another.
Right.
And this I don't think is in the book. I think at this point I can't remember what I made up, but he has a line saying, "So my death sentence came not from a tyrant, but from my lovers." And that irony that his death was at the hands of a virus, bitter irony, and through lovemaking. And it's a prison that he cannot escape. It's the final prison. So yes, it's in a way dramatically the climactic scene of the opera.
And from a musical standpoint, did you use a device that I suppose was a metaphor that was musically the metaphor for this imprisonment?
Well, it's a wonderful scene in that the chorus is celebrating New Year's in the background, and they partake in the scene periodically. So the laughter of the partiers becomes a mocking laughter to what Reinaldo's saying. And of course, their music is thematically tied to the prisoners and the torture and so forth. And then Reinaldo has feverish visions of his persecutor in Cuba, and also then of his mentor, his inspiration, and his muses that urge him to go on and to write his memoir. Yes, it's a culminating scene. There's many threads that are tied up in there.
And then you mentioned the epilogue, so we will not talk about that specifically, but that was something. Why did you put in an epilogue? Again,
I did not want the work to be about hopelessness, because it's the opposite. It's about hope. And the fact that his works live on, and in a way he was victorious over his enemies.
Right.
And
right.
So it has that kind of a sense to the end of it.
Fine. Any last comments that you want to make about the opera and the experience for the audience? Any tips to the audience?
I have nothing against being entertaining, as people think of opera being highbrow and all that. Yes, it's serious. It's very moving and engaging. But I really hope to give the audience value and a good time. So I hope that that is there.
Jorge Martin, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Charles. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.